Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, family, and everybody. I am Professor Motsa Matikane, the Vice Principal for Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement, and Student Support. I am presiding over this wonderful occasion of the University of South Africa, the inaugural lecture of Professor BA Dube. Family, friends, and everyone, you're all welcome. Madam Vice Chancellor, Professor Lenkabula, the Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa. Professor O.J. Kole, Executive Dean of the College of Law. Our inaugurant, Professor B.A. Dube, Professor in the Department of Public, Constitutional and International Law in the College of Law, UNISA. And our respondent, Professor Oladeju Olawu, Professor in the Department of Legal Studies at Walter Sisulu Universities. Members of Professor Dube's family in attendance here today, colleagues, friends, and everybody who is in this occasion, I wish to greet you. Good afternoon. Prof Dube, I offer my warmest congratulations on your academic success. This is the culmination of many years of dedication and hard work. But of course, this is only part of the story. You know the rest of the story very well. The support of family and the academic community always makes it all possible for any scholar to achieve their greatest. This is why we in the University of South Africa actually emphasize on research, teaching, and community engagement, for the reason that these three pillars typify our total duty of scholarship to our own community. Prof Dube, looking at your research, one can see that you articulate the fact that colonialism has three components, that is dispossession, dependence, and oppression of the indigenous people wherever the colonial mark ever landed. We are delighted as a university to have scholars of your caliber that sets out to shed some light on just how colonial societies can extricate themselves from such snares. Ladies and gentlemen, I really don't want to steal thunder from the inaugurant and from other colleagues who are still going to speak. I don't want to take much time. I'm just whetting your appetite. I shall actually now stop and invite Professor O.J. Kole, who is the Executive Dean of the College of Law, to introduce the scholar. After he has done so, he will be duly followed by Prof Dube himself. And after Prof Dube has done his bit and shown us what research he is doing, Professor Oladeju Olawu, who is the respondent, shall follow. Professor Kole, it's your turn. Please come forward. Thank you.
Let me acknowledge the Vice Chancellor and the Principal, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, the Vice Principal of Teaching and Learning, Community Engagement and Student Support, Professor Motsa Matikane, Unisens at large, students and members of staff, guests, ladies and gentlemen, please accept my greetings. We gather here today for inaugural lecture of Professor Buhle Angelo Dube. Who is Professor Buhle Angelo Dube? Professor Buhle Angelo Dube is a professor of international law at the University of South Africa in the College of Law. He holds, amongst others, the degree of Doctor of Laws from the University of Western Cape with focus on universal jurisdiction, and has trained for a Master of Business Leadership for the School of Business Leadership in UNISA. Professor Dube is a qualified commercial pilot, fixed wing, currently working on his instructor rating. His research interests straddle the two areas of international law and aviation. He has published a book entitled Universal Jurisdiction in Respect of International Crimes, Theory and Practice in Africa, 2016, Galda Verlag, Germany, and done work on the jurisdictional rules of the failed tribunal for Malaysia Flight MH17. Professor Dube has also previously participated in the United Nations International Law Fellowship Program at the Peace Palace, The Hague, in 2009. In 2008, Professor Dube served as a law clerk to Justice T.H. Madala at the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Johannesburg. In the same year, he became a Justice Maker's Fellow after winning the prestigious Global Award administered by the International Bridges to Justice. He has previously worked as a lecturer and a senior lecturer at the University of Swaziland and the University of the Western Cape. He has been trained in the law of war and the law of unmanned aerial systems in the context of war by the GCSP, Geneva, Swaziland. Professor Dube is currently the editor-in-chief of the South African Yearbook of International Law, a D-Head accredited journal that resides within the Department of Public Constitutional and International Law at UNISA. He is also part of the research division within Black Forum South Africa, responsible for establishing a multidisciplinary Afro-centered journal. Professor Dube is a firm believer in mentorship as tool for transformation. As such, he co-founded the African Peer Growth Network. Apart from his participation in moot court training at UNISA, Professor Dube also runs his own research-focused YouTube channel aptly named The Research Platform, which imparts knowledge on research and writing within the academic space, and a second channel styled Angela Dube Flying Jurist, which focuses on empowering emerging aviators. He is also interested in law and technology and is a member of the Future of Law Network, based in Berlin, Germany, and a member of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers. He is also a convener of the quarterly Public Law Roundtable at Public, Constitutional and International Law. He is joined today by friends, colleagues, family members to whom he is indebted for the milestone, particularly Andile, Kesia, Petra, and Angela. Over to you, Professor Dube. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Angelo Dube with the University of South Africa. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the presence of the UNISA Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Lenkabula. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Z.T. Motsa-Matikane, Vice Principal Teaching and Learning, Community Engagement and Student Support. I'd like to acknowledge Professor O.J. Kole, Acting Executive Dean of the College of Law. I'd like to also acknowledge my respondent, Professor Oladejo Olou, Professor in the Department of Legal Studies, Faculty of Humanities, Social Sciences, Law, and Law at the Walter Sisulu University. Ladies and gentlemen, today I will be delivering my inaugural lecture titled The African Union's Africanized Criminal Justice System, a Missed Opportunity to Decolonize International Criminal Law. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to start looking at Africa as a staging area for atrocities. The core crimes, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, have afflicted humanity for hundreds of years. Together with the crime of aggression, these three crimes form a large part of the international criminal justice machinery, and we've been dealing with these over the years. My lecture focuses on only the three core crimes, that is war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This is because quite often, violations of international criminal law occur in the context of the commission of the above three crimes. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, estimates that as of 2022, there were over 100 conflicts across the world, that is wars or areas of conflict going on across the world, involving some 600 armed groups and 35 of these were in Africa. Whilst violations of human rights and the three core crimes occur even outside the context of armed conflict, it is known that armed conflict is a very fertile area for such violations. In fact, it's a platform for the most egregious of human violations. So given the widespread violations of human rights on the African continent, one would expect that the African Union, as a continental governing body, would strengthen its laws, its policies, its practices to deal with these violations. Instead, what we observed in the past few years was a contestation for the international criminal justice space between the AU and other global penal platforms, such as the International Criminal Court, the ICC. This contestation led to scholars from both the Global South and the Global North accusing the AU of not taking human rights seriously and not committing to the ideal to end impunity. The accusation stood in stark contrast to what the AU's official stance was on the need to eradicate impunity and to ensure accountability for gross human rights violations. It became clear that the AU regarded the ICC intervention as an interference with its members' sovereignty and as an attempt to stifle Africa's attempts to solve African problems using African solutions. But how do we then understand the AU's aversion to the ICC and how it perceived the ICC intervention as an interference in Africa? African states have been consistent in expressing their disgust at what they perceived as a skewed or biased application of international criminal justice by the ICC and by other penal tribunals, such as those from domestic courts of states in the Global North. Many declarations and resolutions of the AU Assembly bear testimony to this. The ICC was established by the Rome Statute after 120 states adopted the treaty that establishes the ICC in 1998. It then came into force some 4 years later after 60 ratifications were obtained. This penal tribunal was a response to the lacuna that existed in as far as punishing perpetrators of gross human rights violations and architects of the three core crimes was concerned. The main motivation behind the AU stance was that the ICC the main motivation behind the stance of the IU towards the ICC was that the ICC was focused on punishing or dealing with those situations that only involve African leaders, whilst ignoring similar, if not more egregious situations occurring elsewhere in the world. Since the ICC became seized of the first case in a matter involving the former Congolese rebel leader Thomas Lubanga in 2009, it has consistently been accused of being a neo-colonial venture. Could there be any credence to these claims? An examination of the ICC revealed that at least up to 2014, all the situations that the ICC was seized with occurred within the African soil. These include situations in Kenya, in the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Darfur, Libya, Mali, Burundi, and Uganda. All of these are African countries. As of today, all 31 cases before the ICC are from Africa. In 2016, however, the ICC became seized with a matter involving the state of Georgia, when the ICC prosecutor authorized a proprio motu investigation, and this marked the very first time that this international tribunal ventured outside Africa. Since then, the ICC has been involved in the investigation of situations outside Africa, including Palestine in March 2021, Afghanistan in March 2020, Myanmar in November 2019, the Philippines in September 2021, Venezuela November 2021, and Ukraine in March 2022. However, it is worth noting that these situations may not necessarily turn into cases before the ICC for one reason or another. It is further noteworthy that at the height of the AU's discontent with the ICC's bias towards Africa, the statistical data indeed corroborated the AU's version. It is clear from the statistics why the AU would harbor so much unhappiness, to the extent that a handful of its members would actually mull withdrawing from the Rome Statute in protest. Indeed, in October and November 2016, several African states began the process of exiting the statute: South Africa, Burundi, and the Gambia. Burundi was the only one of those countries to successfully withdraw in October 2017, while South Africa's efforts became stalled in the courts. The Gambia decided to reverse course. The scepter of universal jurisdiction as a compounding factor in this conundrum. Apart from the ICC making inroads into Africa, governments across the continent were also rattled by the by the actions of global North states in charging and arresting African politicians. Needless to say, this offended the sovereignty of African states and drew customary international law into the matrix. Illustrative in this scenario was the case involving Belgium, in which the case involving Belgium and DRC, that is the arrest warrant case, which appeared before the International Criminal Court of Justice, the ICJ. A Belgian domestic court had issued an arrest warrant for a Congolese sitting minister, Mr. Yerodia Ndombasi, who was a foreign affairs minister, apparently for his alleged involvement in crimes against humanity. The ICJ held in the DRC's favor, finding that international customary law recognized the immunity of sitting ministers of foreign affairs. The Belgian government's actions were condemned by the AU in a series of resolutions of the Assembly and bolstered African efforts to create an African International Criminal Court. As more and more European arrest warrants were either issued or enforced against African senior state officials, the AU's calls to frustrate universal jurisdiction grew even larger. But how do we locate decolonization within the transformative aspirations of the AU? The AU's exceptions to both the ICC's intervention and those of foreign domestic courts could be understood in the context of decoloniality. That is, that these hallowed systems of international criminal justice were to an appreciable extent colonial in nature and needed to be decolonized. The AU's pushback and attempts to create an autochthonous African criminal justice framework was simply an act of decoloniality. But where exactly would it fit in the decolonial scheme of things? In reality, the AU's decolonial aspirations can be read from its fortuitous engagement with decolonization, which in many ways is still steeped in the 1960s approach. For instance, in 2018, the AU's participation in the ICJ case involving the Chagos archipelago, which was undertaken as a means of reversing the negative impact of British colonialism and ushering the Chagos archipelago into the League of Free States, was not done as a decolonial project. Rather, it was done as a means of challenging the impact of British colonialism on African soil and African lives. It was not necessarily done as a means of decolonizing international law per se. In all its other challenges towards Western impositions on the African continent, the AU was neither emphatic in nor aligned positively with the decolonial movement. It can be said that where decolonization is concerned, the AU's actions and inactions simply aligned with the aspirations of decoloniality in its contemporary sense by sheer accident. The above notwithstanding, decoloniality can somehow be read into the aspirations of the AU, without the continental body emphatically or positively making claims to decolonize international law or international criminal justice. What the African Union sought to do, in essence, in all its opposition to the ICC, was to decolonize international criminal justice in 4 distinct ways. Number 1, to distance itself from the ICC with the hope of withdrawing from its multilateral treaty. Number 2, to frustrate the efforts of the courts of third non-African states to prosecute under universal jurisdiction. Number 3, to delegitimize or bastardize these 2 processes for failure to comply with the standards of civilized nations, such as the rule of law and respect for head of state immunity. Number 4, to establish its own penal tribunal to deal with perpetrators of the core crimes on the African continent. Collectively, these 4 actions would personify the AU's decolonial agenda. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it in his work, Decolonizing the Mind, there is a way to understand this mental transition within the African context. When African states regained independence, the nationalistic bourgeoisie saw images of a vibrant African economy and saw themselves as a bridge, an intermediary between the bourgeois class in the West and the peasant class in Africa. They were best equipped to explain Africa to the world. Prior to assuming office, this petty bourgeoisie drew from African culture, literature, languages, values, proverbs to confront the racist bigotry of the West. It drew its stamina and legitimacy from the peasantry, their proverbs, their fables, their riddles, their wise sayings. When this African bourgeois class assumed political power post-independence, it strengthened rather than weakened the economic links with the former colonizers. Ngugi wa Thiong'o attributes this to a neo-colonial arrangement. Suddenly, the decolonial thought, still drawing strength from African writings, proverbs, sayings, stories and fables, etc., had to find a new home, a new audience. This new audience comprised of the peasantry, the working class, and no longer the petty bourgeoisie, which was now in power. The working class now owned the rhetoric, the demand for Africa's problems to be viewed and addressed through the lenses of class analysis and a re-evaluation of neo-colonial societies. Fast forward to today. Decolonization evokes much debate in many sectors of society, with most of these debates flowing from definitional difficulties. The Oxford Dictionary defines it narrowly as the action or process of a state withdrawing from a former colony, leaving it independent. Unfortunately, this understanding of the concept is rather narrow and reduces it to a mere political phenomenon. Tavenario Haidarian posits that decolonization involves the dismantling, the delinking, rejection, contestation, or waging of a struggle against existing norms. As such, decolonization makes use of many other broadly conflictual approaches. We can also conceive of decolonization as a reflection of self and systems, planning for decolonizing action, and decolonization as action. Excuse me. Perhaps, for one to understand decoloniality, one must first understand coloniality and colonization. In that way, decolonization will simply be seen as the process of dismantling and moving away from coloniality. This approach also requires the understanding that coloniality did not end. It continues in every aspect of our lives today. Coloniality makes us Africans see what the rhetoric of Western modernity wants us to see, that the universal fictions of the global North are applicable and acceptable throughout the world, and especially for the global South. Coloniality refers to the colonial matrix of power, which flows from perceived Western modernity and Western civilization. The colonial matrix of power was and remains to this day a management structure conceived by the Western colonial and successive post-colonial administrations, designed to influence and control all aspects of the non-Western world or the global South. Dismantling these designs, which form the core of the colonial matrix of power, is the essence of decolonization. Although the term recently gained currency on the African continent in general and in South Africa in particular, it is not necessarily new and has been around for some decades. It was widely embraced in the 1960s in a political sense, buoyed by the regaining of independence by African states. There seems to have been a lull in its usage until around about the 2016-2015 era in South Africa, when its development and its usage began to gain currency within the African setting. The hashtag Fees Must Fall and hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movements brought it up, and it gained currency when it called for a transformed, decolonized curriculum eschewed of Western and Eurocentric dogma. If we are to understand decoloniality as the dismantling of Eurocentric and colonial metrics of power, then we are called upon to agree that all the actions of the AU in rejecting the ICC's overreach and bias were decolonial in nature. In light of the above, it is trite that when the AU embarked on legal reforms to its international criminal justice network, it underwent a process of self-reflection, an overhaul of its systems as a way of planning for a decolonized framework, and it actually took action towards achieving this. But did the decolonial aspirations of the AU actually bear fruit? To try and answer that question, one must analyze the AU's actions in trying to establish a parallel international legal framework as a means of dismantling the colonial metrics of power. In other words, the debate or the race that we saw between immunity and impunity on the African continent. Whilst African leaders were vehement in their demand for immunity of heads of states from prosecution and the sovereignty of their states, they were equally vocal on the need to eradicate impunity for the core crimes. In other words, they advocated for the punishment of those involved in gross human rights violations. Their gripe was simply with the usage of the ICC and foreign domestic courts in that process. What was the reason African leaders clinged so strongly onto their perceived immunity? Some legal scholars attribute this affinity to immunity manifesting in impunity as African nostalgia with the political arrangements of the past. In other words, the political arrangements of kingdoms and empires of old, where kings and queens and emperors were untouchables. This is what Professor Fombard calls imperial presidents who wield too much power and hardly leave office. According to this theory, these contemporary African presidents simply want to enjoy the benefits of being untouchable before the law. And the African population also perceives them as enjoying the so-called divine right of kings. And as such, they do not demand their prosecution. In other words, this reluctance is informed by a nostalgia or romanticization of the imperial past. This argument is flawed at many levels, and I will unpack some of its misleading elements below. Africans can and have successfully pushed for the prosecution of former presidents or former heads of state for crimes committed whilst in office. The prosecution of Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, Tunisia's Ben Ali, although prosecuted in absentia after he fled the territory. The prosecution of former president of Chad, Hissène Habré, are but a few indications that African leaders, and not necessarily Africans themselves, harbor the reluctance to prosecute. This can be seen even more so in the prosecution of Hissène Habré through the extraordinary African chambers, which was not a consequence of the AU's fidelity to accountability, but an attempt to prevent victims from instituting criminal proceedings against Hissène Habré in the domestic courts of Belgium. This argument also blames lack of effective constitutional provisions for dealing with imperial presidents. The insinuation in this line of argument is that the solutions for the problem lie in Western-designed systems of governance, particularly constitutionalism and the separation of powers. According to this argument, clear constitutional provisions and an independent judiciary are the keys to eradicating the phenomenon of imperial presidents. Is there any merit in the claim that Africa is obsessed with its imperial past? Were African leaders simply motivated by notions of royal privilege and notions of being God's elect in pushing back on the ICC's prosecutorial mission? To unpack this question further, one has to pose the following question. What was at the core of the African leaders' resistance? The answer is that they felt that the inroads made by both the ICC and the foreign domestic courts of European states overlooked their firm belief in employing African solutions for African problems. The AU has always made sure that its stance on African solutions for African problems is known. As such, the AU is very emphatic on streamlining African values into many of its policies. Nothing can be more decolonial than, number one, elevating African values which were once measured on their repugnance to European notions of natural justice and morality to acceptable values regulating African lives. And number two, mainstreaming those values into the policies, the laws, and the practices of the AU. By leaning more towards an Afrocentric value-based remedy for African problems, such as fighting impunity and the preservation of life and dignity, the AU could be seen as decolonizing international law on the continent and transforming international criminal justice. It will thus be jettisoning coloniality, its values, and their perceived universality. From the days of the OAU until now, the continental body has aspired to one form of decolonization or another, given in the early 60s, the focus was on regaining self-governance and independence. Over the years, this term has taken a different meaning and has slowly come to embrace the extolling of African values as a panacea for African challenges and understanding the role of Africa, the role of the African, and the role of African values to human development. For instance, in Aspiration 2, Goal 3 of Agenda 2063, the AU places a premium on Pan-Africanism and decolonization. In Aspiration 5, the AU seeks to entrench the consciousness of the African people, which can be understood as a push for decolonization of the mind. All these require resort to what the AU has always extolled as a panacea for African problems, that is, African values. If these values matter that much, why did African leaders resist the enforcement of these same values, albeit via the instrumentality of the ICC and the domestic courts of European states? Although there are plenty of African values that could have been infused into the framework of the Malabo Protocol that the AU adopted in its attempt to decolonize international criminal justice, I will limit myself to only those values that are directly linked to individual accountability under international criminal law. The divine right of kings, viewed as an inherited anomaly. Pre-colonial African leadership, whilst accommodating elements of the divine, to some extent, did not elevate kings, queens, and emperors to gods. It simply acknowledged the role of the divine in the institution of kingship, queenship, and emperorship. The corruption of this understanding came with the colonial authorities when they imported from the global north dangerous notions or dangerous ideas such as the divine right of kings. English constitutional law is awash with iterations of the state and the king being the most supreme thing on earth, with the king being perceived not only as God's lieutenant, but as a God himself. This was popularized by the English monarch James I, and it went on to form the dominant political doctrine to defend absolutism in the global north. According to this doctrine, or according to this colonial worldview, the legal system could not molest the king because to do so would be to molest God himself. Effectively, the king in Europe was immune from legal process for everything done or omitted to be done under the sun. When the global north unleashed its colonial enterprise, it imported this outdated 16th century European belief with it, save that its enjoyment was only reserved for the colonial administration. The European king could command forces to kill, steal, rape, pillage, and destroy without consequence, all in the name of the empire, as we saw in the DRC when the king of Belgium decimated the population there. The African king was not so lucky. Illustrative in this case are the likes of King Cetshwayo of Amazulu, who was taken prisoner and banished to Cape Town, King Bunu of Swaziland, who was prosecuted for murder by the British in Manzini, Swaziland in 1899, Prophetess Metikalili Wamenza of Kenya in the late 1800s. The motivation was that there could not be a king or a queen in Europe and a king or a queen in Africa. The colonial administrator had to show its might, its perceived supremacy. Needless to say, when the leaders of African states regained their independence, they had seen the power of the divine right of kings and the impunity it came with, and they wanted some of it for themselves. Whilst there might be truth that the yearning for the contemporary type of immunity may have stemmed from that divine right of kings, it is totally unfortunate to perceive it as a purely African thing, a hearkening to a so-called authentic African past. It was instead inherited as a political arrangement after the efficacy of that doctrine to serve a dictator was observed in the colonial administration. On the contrary, the African value system embraced accountability. Hence the idiom, "Iqala kaliboli," in Sizulu, isiNdebele, and Siswati, meaning that even if the perpetrator went on the run, even after a period of years had elapsed, the crime remained intact, and the perpetrator would, once found, be forced to account. But in the context of the divine right of kings, the notion that the king can do no wrong, having been popularized by the colonial authorities, African presidents began to emulate their colonizers post-independence. Indeed, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it, it is the final triumph of a system of domination when the dominated start singing its virtues. We have today constitutions on the African continent which effectively place the political head above the law. For instance, Section 50 of the Constitution of Lesotho clothes the king with immunity from private and criminal proceedings for all things done or omitted to be done in his personal capacity. The king enjoys this immunity whilst in office. Whether a king in Sesotho tradition can leave office can best be answered by resort to the calamity that befell King Mshweshwe II in 1970 and 1990 when he was forced into exile and removed from office. Unlike the Lesotho clause, Section 11 of the Swaziland Constitution provides similar immunity but does not limit it to the duration of the king's tenure in office. It simply does not envisage a king ever leaving office. And indeed, in the Siswati tradition, the only form of exiting from that office is through the death of the office holder. The Swaziland clause stipulates that the king and his customary equivalent, the Ingwenyama, are both immune from any legal process for anything done or omitted to be done under the sun. Equally, Section 46 of the Constitution of Morocco provides that the king of Morocco is inviolable, thereby effectively making him immune from all legal suit. Ubuntu is a value depicting shared or common dignity. The value of Ubuntu could have contributed to the goal to eradicate impunity. And it could have ensured that imperial presidents are subjected to the rule of law. Quite often, Ubuntu is wrongly perceived as applying horizontally. Many scholars have simply reduced Ubuntu to I am because you are, thereby depriving this value a chance to be fully applied to solve the socio-political problems afflicting the African continent today. Ubuntu is not as limited as these scholars portrayed. The term is applicable in the context of vertical relationships too. That is, the ones where there is a so-called political inferior and a so-called political superior. Ubuntu does not necessarily perceive the leader, the king, the emperor, the queen, the president as a god. It demands that a leader be humane and treat those under his leadership in a humane way. It predicates the legitimacy of that leader on the endorsement offered by the people he leads. In other words, the king, the emperor, the president, the queen, their legitimacy to claim the throne flows from the people. Viewed in this way, Ubuntu translates to Inkosi Nkosi Ngabantu, in much the same way as Ubuntu's full version is Umuntu Ngumuntu Ngabantu. It thus places a duty on both the king and the people to recognize, protect, and show humanity of the next individual. Thus, Ubuntu has no room for the impunity-prone imperial president. The next value that I would like to look into that the AU could have infused into or could have used to understand how to go about decolonizing its international criminal legal framework is the value called umlomo ongathetimanga. There is a second African value that is often branded about in an attempt to justify the actions of the imperial president. This misunderstood concept has gained traction since the push for immunity of presidents on the African continent. It is said that the king cannot lie, implying that the king is infallible and as such cannot be subjected to legal scrutiny. This misconceived African value is also abused by those who fail to understand the context and true meaning of this proverb in the days prior to colonization of African people. When Africans say that Inkosi umlomo ongathetimanga, they were not necessarily referring to the infallible nature of the king. Rather, its implication was that the words uttered by the king were not his own. This was informed by the fact that the king took decisions via consultation with the various assemblies that he would form from time to time. It is those assemblies that would come together, deliberate, debate, exchange views, and then come to a conclusion. The king would simply endorse the views of those consultative meetings. As such, whatever he pronounced upon, whatever he endorsed, were not necessarily his words, but the words of the assembly. Hence the saying or the idiom, umlomo ongathetimanga, the mouth that does not lie. It was not necessarily the African equivalent of immunity or impunity. Today, those kings and presidents that are accused of violating their own people are not in the habit of consulting anyone. They simply do as they please, and when the long arm of the law is visited upon them, they decry such prosecutorial inroads as violating their customary international law immunities. But how do we situate the African Criminal Court within the AU's failures to decolonize international criminal law. It is tried that the failures of the AU in that sense epitomized a very huge failure on the part of the AU to dismantle Eurocentrism and usher in Afrocentrism. Faced with a growing criticism for its failure to provide functioning systems for holding perpetrators of core crimes accountable and a growing number of violations on the continent, the AU sought to create a parallel legal framework. This it tried to do by transforming the African Court of Justice and Human Rights into an African International Criminal Court through the addition of a criminal chamber that would deal with those who violated human rights and who committed the core crimes on the African continent. This action could be seen as the boldest step in the decolonization of international criminal law on the continent by the AU. This was the moment for the AU to incorporate the African values I've just alluded to and the African ways of being that it has always publicized and it has always motivated for. The AU did not infuse those values into the framework of the ACC or the African Criminal Court. Instead, the continental body favored the current version of immunity contained in Article 46A bis of the Malabo Protocol, which seeks to clothe heads of states and governments and other senior state officials with immunity from prosecution. Several challenges are presented by this approach. Number one, the extension of immunity to a new category called senior state officials is rather nebulous and prone to misinterpretation and abuse. Number two, although under the current version of the Article 46A bis immunity, this immunity can only be enjoyed during tenure of office. The very first draft of this very same clause was indicative of the AU's firm belief that this immunity should operate ad infinitum. It was only the public outcry from various stakeholders that forced the organization to adopt the current version of the clause, which now seeks to limit this immunity to the tenure of office of the affected president. What is interesting, or rather the irony from the AU's approach, is that whilst its response was predicated on the allegation that the ICC was using lawfare to target African leaders, the AU itself, in enacting the Malabo Protocol, was also accused of engaging in lawfare. Lawfare, which refers to the use and abuse of the rule of law as a means of achieving a certain political goal, has for a long time been a forte of the West. When the AU began engaging in lawfare, it was clear that it had to put its house in order, in order to protect its heads of state from the ICC. So, to be seen to be putting its house in order, the AU had to have a court and a law with teeth that can bite. The Malabo Protocol was its best attempt at doing just that. Yet, when presented with that chance, the AU failed and or refused to infuse long-established African values, such as the value of Ubuntu, the proverb that inkosi inkosi ngabantu, and all other values that I've alluded to above. The AU missed out on an opportunity to dismantle the colonial metrics of power, to replace problematic Eurocentric norms with autochthonous African values that would help advance the lives and dignity of all Africans. It is thus safe to conclude that the AU missed out on a golden opportunity to decolonize international criminal justice and to dislodge so-called Eurocentric values and replace them with authentic African values and ways of being. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my inaugural lecture, and I thank you.
Standing on the existing protocols, one of the natural, even if unintended consequences of the expansion of international criminal justice has been the increasingly prominent role of several intergovernmental agencies beyond the UN Security Council. Although African states were active at various periods in the creation of the international criminal justice system as seen through the International Criminal Tribunals for former Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and lately the proposed Special Court for Central African Republic, the African Union, AU, as the umbrella body of African states, is emerging as a principal role actor in the operational processes of the international criminal justice system. With the adoption of the Malabo Protocol on the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, the AU has ventured into previously uncharted terrains. Coterminous with this, the AU's role in the creation of the Extraordinary Chamber for the trial of former Chadian dictator Hissène Habré for alleged torture and crimes against humanity committed in Chad remains a clear illustration of the AU's expanding ventures into the unraveling schema of international criminal justice. The voices of various AU organs, particularly the Assembly, the Pan-African Parliament, and the Peace and Security Council, in deliberations around universal jurisdiction and the International Criminal Court and its work in Africa, combine to showcase a panoply of novel visages. The seminal contribution of Professor Angelo Dube in this inaugural lecture situates international criminal prosecutions within a deeper philosophical interrogation of orthodox responses to conflict and associated atrocities in Africa. It accentuates the dynamic involvements of the African Union and its various structures. The core postulations of Professor Dube's lecture are threefold. One, that if the notion of decolonization is to have any substantive impact within the transformative agenda of the AU, the manifestations must be seen and tested through an autochthonous African criminal justice framework. Two, that the AU's utilization of legalism to entrench and reinforce a system of immunity for African rulers and their collaborators in office and beyond office amounts to a reinforcement of impunity, is a regrettably missed opportunity to make a clean break with our colonial past, and is a disservice to the victims of homegrown atrocities and violations across Africa. Three, through illuminating dissection of pertinent African indigenous value systems as expressed through age-long conventions, customs, proverbs, wise sayings, and practices, Professor Dube accentuated the ramparts, the pillars upon which the AU could have built its legacy for a decolonized international criminal legal framework for Africa and Africans. The core message of concern that I deduced from Professor Dube's inaugural lecture can be summed up in one rhetorical question: of what use is seeking to dismantle the vestiges of colonial structures of international criminal justice only to replace them with neo-colonial apparatchiks that surreptitiously reinforce discredited principles, practices, and orthodoxies. Despite the grim labyrinths of his discourse, Professor Dube is neither melancholic nor fallen. Is red flagging a trend which ordinarily could have missed the purview of even the most diligent international criminal law and justice scholars across Africa is laudable. He has, through this noble event, succeeded in paving the way for upcoming generations of African scholars in the interconnected fields of international criminal justice, accountability and transitional justice, as well as international human rights law, to engage with his postulations, his prescriptions, and his precepts. The minimum that we can offer is to disseminate Professor Dube's ideas to the critical mass of African researchers everywhere they may be. To this end, I wish to implore the authorities at UNISA to motivate and support Professor Dube in convening a continent-wide transdisciplinary summit on the challenges, gaps, and opportunities in the AU's agenda for international criminal justice that he has flagged for us through this lecture. On that note, I wish to congratulate the impressive presenter for a noble journey well run, and to wish him all the aura, the gusto, the vista, and the zest required for his professional career and life's odysseys. Thank you very much.
It is a job well done. Congratulations again, Prof. Congratulations, Nyamazane. That's how we say it in my mother tongue, the Dube clan's name. Now it is my honor to say welcome aboard the community of scholars, Prof. Dube. Congratulations for attaining such a high level of scholarship. We're looking forward to more research coming from you, to more students being supervised by yourself, but more than anything, to you assisting the community of the Republic of South Africa and the world over to have a better life through your profession. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Prof Puleng Lenkabule, I wish to bring this event to a close, and I wish all of you the best as you move forward to celebrate with our celebrated scholar. Good night. Nihambe kahle. Siyabonga.